You're listening to Storytime in Paris on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content and to join our book club, please join us on Patreon. Since well before Victor Hugo looked up at Notre Dame and thought, what if a hunchback lived in there? Authors have been inspired by Paris. Welcome to the Storytime in Paris podcast on Paris Underground Radio, where we keep that tradition alive by showcasing an author with a French connection in each episode. Every episode will feature 5 questions asked by you, our author's biggest fans, and answered live on air. Then our authors will treat us to a reading of an excerpt from their book. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity. Would you like to join the Storytime in Paris book club? Head on over to patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio and stay tuned to the end of this episode for more information. My guest this week is New York Times bestselling author Martha Hall Kelly. In fact, Martha's debut novel, Lilac Girls, became a New York Times bestseller the week it was published. It then went on to sell over 2 million copies and be published in 50 countries. She followed that book with 2 more in the series. Martha's latest book, The Golden Doves, is a standalone work of historical fiction set just in the aftermath of World War II. It features 2 female former spies, one hunting down an infamous Nazi doctor, and one searching for a son who may or may not still be alive. So, without further ado, please allow me to introduce Martha Hall Kelly, author of The Golden Doves. Hello, Martha. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Can you start by telling us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
I am Martha Hall Kelly, and I'm a women's fiction writer. I live in New York and Connecticut and now Florida.
Do you have a connection to Paris and to France?
I wish it was a stronger connection. My books are published in France, and I love France, and I write a lot about France. So, that's my connection.
Have you visited?
A lot. First in college, and then I came back. And once I started writing my first book, Lilac Girls, I gave one of my protagonists, Caroline Faraday, a French boyfriend, just so that I could set a lot of things in France. And so I did a lot of research there, especially because Caroline Faraday from Lilac Girls was a huge Francophile, and they would spend every summer there. And there's an archive there in Nanterre. Is that how you say it?
Nanterre, yeah.
One of the suburbs. So I spent a lot of time in that archive, and I get some of my best research from that archive about Caroline through her letters with Geneviève de Gaulle.
Amazing. Do you speak and read French?
I do not. I had to hire a translator from Craigslist, and it was hilarious.
Oh, wow.
She didn't give me her real name, which was smart because she didn't know who I was. And at the end, she said, "Did you realize that my name that I gave you is Josephine Boulanger?" It was Josephine Baker in French. That was like her fake name.
Oh, that's funny.
We had fun, though. I mean, we sat for days in the archives with her just translating letters and got a lot of good stuff.
That's amazing. So can you tell us a little bit about The Golden Doves?
The Golden Doves is about 2 women, Josie and Arlette. And Josie's an American woman, and Arlette is French, half German. She grew up in Alsace. And the 2 of them meet when Josie starts working for the underground, and she's a radio operator, and she's very young. She's just a teenager. But, in Paris, occupied Paris, the Germans had become so good at hunting down radio operators, the adults. And I think something like 95% of them were caught and most of the time executed. But Josie is recruited because there aren't that many people left that could do the job. And she's just a really smart person. And they become known in Paris as the Golden Doves because they live in an apartment in the Flower and Bird Market. and it backs up to the police station where the Gestapo is. And they have a ringside seat to all the secrets. So they become, they outwit the Gestapo by, giving all their secrets to the SOE and become known as the Golden Doves. They do get caught, sadly, and sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp. One of my other books, Lilac Girls, my first book, was set there. And sadly, they each lose something really very, very important to them at the camp. Josie loses her mother, and Arlette loses her son, a baby that she had at a Lebensborn home by a Wehrmacht soldier. So the story starts 7 years later, once they get out of Ravensbrück, and they're both just wounded people. And they team up again to find a bad doctor that did terrible things to them at the camp.
Excellent. So as I understand it, your first 3 books are part of a series, right? You've got the Lilac Girls and the Lost Roses and Sunflower Sisters.
Right.
And they're all related. And this is your first book outside of that series.
Yes. Although there are a few characters that overlap a little bit from Lilac Girls.
That was going to be my next question was it difficult to leave those characters behind from that series to concentrate on another set of people?
It wasn't so hard, but it did seem like it made sense because Josie, the American, works with Army intelligence in the United States at Fort Bliss in Texas. And she is charged with the task of hunting down this Dr. Snow, a German doctor. And she goes all over the world. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if at Ravensbrück, this Dr. Snow knew Herta Oberhauser, who Herta is one of the main point of view characters in Lilac Girls. So, and I get a lot of mail of people asking me, what happened with Herta? And so I just thought this would be kind of an interesting way of showing people what happened to Herta.
Oh, I love that.
Because Josie goes and interviews her in jail.
So is this book going to be part of a series as well?
Well, it ends on a cliffhanger. I don't know. That's up to my publisher. If they want me to do it again, I think it would have to be really successful in order for them to go, oh, yes, why don't you do a sequel? Although my husband and I, of course, have already plotted it all out. He calls himself plot whisperer. And at night, we talk about plot. So I already have the plot all, thought out, but we'll see. Sometimes sequels don't do as well as the main book, so we'll see.
That's fun. I love the idea of a plot whisperer over a glass of wine. I feel like every writer should get one of those.
Oh, yes. And he's a really good one. He was a history major in college, and he loves France. That's a big part of why I keep writing about France, because we always get to come visit my French publisher, which is Charleston's Editions. And it's really fun to talk to him about it because he's way into it.
So you mentioned that we go back to Ravensbrück in this book, this women's concentration camp. Was it difficult to return back to that world again, to go back to this concentration camp in your writing?
What was not so much difficult emotionally, but it was difficult because I wanted to make sure that if people had read Lilac Girls already, that they weren't like, oh, brother, here we are back at this place. I wanted to make it fresh and make sure there were new things to show people. And one of those things that I hadn't been able to write about with my first book, Lilac Girls, was the Kinderzimmer. And I had always been interested because that was, ordinarily babies that came to the camp were done away with by the Nazis. Hitler said no children at the concentration camps, and they interpreted that as, well, we need to kill them then. So unless they had German blood or were special. And so this was an opportunity for the Nazis at Ravensbrück to create a special block just for expectant mothers and mothers with young children, because they found that the moms would become depressed if their babies were taken away. And this way, they could live with their children. And they did an experiment of sorts to see if that was going to make them more productive workers. So I wanted to include that in this book.
Can you talk a little bit about the research that you did for this book?
Well, I wrote it during COVID. And one of the things that I became interested in with Josie running around looking for this Dr. Snow all over the world was, how did real life fugitive Nazis like Mengele, how did they escape? And I realized that they did it through the rat line. And they would come down through Germany, and with the aid of the Catholic Church in Rome, they would live along the way in monasteries, dressed oftentimes as monks, and they would wait for their papers and for money to go on the rat line to South America or other places. It wasn't just South America. So as soon as COVID lifted travel restrictions to Italy, my husband and I went, and we traced the rat line from northern Italy all the way down.
Oh, wow.
All the way down to Rome. And it was really, really interesting, horrifying. I mean, I am Catholic myself, and there were a lot of Catholics that did wonderful things during the Holocaust and during World War II to help people. But this one bishop, Bishop Udall, was not one of them. He was called the Brown Bishop, and he helped thousands of fugitive Nazis escape. It's once I dug into it, I was just so horrified by it and ended up putting it in the book.
That's really interesting. I was wondering which parts of the book were based on fact, and I didn't know about this rat line. I had heard some vague things, but I didn't know about it, certainly not as like clearly and specifically as you talk about it in this book. Was that the impetus for the book? Is that where the whole idea sprang from?
Not really, but when it sprang more from one of the women, Nina Ivanska, who was a real rabbit. The rabbits, if you haven't read Lilac Girls, were women that were experimented on at Ravensbrück. They were teenagers. There was one real life rabbit that came to this country. A friend of mine, a cardiologist at Beth Israel Hospital, dug into his archives and found a newspaper clipping about Nina Ivanska and how she was getting corrective surgeries in the 1950s at Beth Israel. And some of the doctors came to her and said, oh, by the way, in this medical journal, there's this picture of this guy, Walter Schreiber, and he's over here. He was the Surgeon General of the Third Reich. Does he look familiar? And she said, oh my God, he was in charge of my surgeries. He was the head of it. And what is he doing here at Fort Bliss, Texas? And they said, well, he's here for this thing called Operation Paperclip. I don't know if they knew that was the covert name, but the US has brought all these German scientists to this country who, had horrible resumes, killed all sorts of people, and many of them. And this guy just like slipped through the cracks and came over because they wanted his biological weapons background. And so once she blew the whistle on them, she went to the FBI, she ID'd him and said, what's going on? They went to the Boston Globe. So the whole country and the world found out about it through Nina Ivanska. And I just thought, I want to tell that story.
I just got chills. That's what hooked me about this book in the first place, because you start off in 1952 and we're in Fort Bliss, and I didn't know any of this. I've read a lot of books, having done this podcast, about World War II, but this time period right after the war, I have not read much about, and certainly I didn't know about the Russian and US sort of fascination with quote unquote ex-Nazis. Can you talk a little bit about the research that you did around that part of the story?
Yeah, it was really helpful to read Operation Paperclip by Annie Jacobson. I have it in every form. Her audiobook is amazing. And she tells the story. She's such a good writer. And it's nonfiction, but she explains how the whole thing happened in a very matter-of-fact way, how the Americans and the Russians were fighting basically over these German scientists that were kind of left behind after the Nuremberg trials. And the US, what they started doing was, just to be safe so that the Soviets didn't get them, they would bring over any scientists that had any kind of whiff of, possibility that they could use them. And they put a little paperclip on their folder. And that was the covert signal that that person was to be brought over. And they brought them to Fort Bliss and other places as well. And they lived, as Josie in the book says, eating barbecue and drinking bourbon and talking about how great Hitler was. And so a lot of people didn't know about it, especially at first. But then Walter von Braun, who was the poster boy for that Operation Paperclip, was vaulted as, helping with the space program. But there were a lot of other guys that, did a lot of really bad things that were just kind of conveniently forgotten.
Does French culture sometimes leave you scratching your head? Well, you might enjoy listening to our sister podcast, Navigating the French, hosted by journalist Emily Monaco. Each episode focuses on a different word in the French language, and Emily is joined by an expert who will help explore what that word says about French culture. Listen now to Navigating the French on ParisUndergroundRadio.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris.
That's the part that's shocking. And I think I knew this. I think, there's a Philip Roth book that I read a long time ago. So I think I had this idea in the back of my head somewhere that this operation had existed. But it's just so shocking that people would pretend that they're no longer Nazis because Hitler is no longer in power. Everyone just collectively is like, oh no, it's fine now. They're no longer Nazis.
I think a big part of that, yes, you're exactly right. But I think the America was ready to move on. We just said, okay, that was rough. A lot of guys died, and not just Americans, but in every country. And I think the world just wanted to move on. And that's why they let Herta out. Herta Oberhauser was the only female doctor at the all-female Camp Ravensbrück, and she participated in the surgeries, and she got a 25-year sentence, and they let her out after 5 because the U.S. government was like, okay, well, let's move on. So they didn't even get the German government was really pressuring the U.S. and other countries to let these criminals go after, crimes against humanity had been proven. But there wasn't a lot of support in the U.S. to just keep going with that.
That's so upsetting. That's really upsetting.
I know. I know. Yeah. But on the other hand, it was hard for them too, because they really thought that Russia was this huge threat. And, any minute it was, they were going to annihilate us. So, it was a tough.
I get that. And I get to the idea of turning away from the worst in humanity and saying, okay, this was a blip. This isn't a real thing. Let's not dwell on this because it was so upsetting. I understand that too. But I appreciated you exploring that. It was really interesting to read about all of those interactions and this time period that I don't get to really read about very often. So I appreciated that.
Well, you're young, so you don't remember a lot. Older people. My father-in-law was a naval aviator, and he used to talk about it a lot, bombing the U-boats and right in New York Harbor. And my uncle was shot down over Messina, Italy. So I remember them talking about it. So I think that's an important thing to keep it alive so that people remember.
I think you're right. So we end up traveling a lot in this book, which is really exciting. I enjoyed that a lot. We get to visit a lot of different locations and see lots of different things and castles in Austria and all of that. We spent a lot of time in French Guiana. Can you talk about that? Why did you decide to set part of your book there?
Well, Arlette, the French girl, it's told in alternating chapters. And Arlette works at a little coffee shop in Paris. And one day a man comes to her, and a very wealthy looking man, and says, I think I may know where your son is, the little baby that she had lost at the camp, who would now be around 9 years old. And she has spent every waking minute of every year since losing him trying to find him. And he offers her the opportunity to go to this charity orphanage down in French Guiana. And he and his grandmother run it. And they're called the Minots. They're French. And so she has to decide, should I go down there or not? And I have been inspired by, I don't know if you've seen the Netflix show Sinister Sect. It's about Colonia Dignidad. When I wrote this, I had never seen it. But since then, I've seen this documentary. And it's about an orphanage in Chile And it's run by a German man named Paul Schaefer, was run. And he had been drummed out of Germany after the war. And he was running, I guess you'd call it a cult, this closed sect that had all these orphans from after the war. And he just took them all down to Chile and created this horrific place that they did horrible things to women. They were trying to further Hitler's ideology. And so I thought, why don't I take that and put it in French Guiana, because my people are French. And that's what inspired my Hope Home in the book, which is an orphanage where Arlette goes with this man, Luc Minot, to find out if maybe her son is actually down there or not.
Super interesting. And have you had the chance to visit French Guiana?
I have not, because that was during COVID. And I had time to do once the COVID travel restrictions were lifted was go to Italy. But I didn't get a chance to go to French Guiana. I'd love to, though.
Your descriptions are very vivid. Aside from the plot points, it made me really want to visit. Maybe not experience what happened in the book, but
not so great.
So I find Josie and Arlette's relationship really interesting as well, because they're both very different. They're the same in that they're both very driven. They are both looking for something very specific, and they're very determined to find that thing. But they go in very different directions. They're linked by something in the past, but they go in very different directions. Was it challenging to craft this relationship and to see them go in such separate directions?
No, but no one's asked me that question yet. I loved the idea that Josie was American and had to kind of go back to her old life, even though they were such good friends. And, they would each die for each other. They're such good friends. And of course, Arlette ended up back in Paris with her own life. But I have so many friends that is the way that it worked. And the minute we meet up again, it's just like we never left each other. On my book tour that I just went on, every city that I went to, there was someone there that came to an old friend. And I just thought, why are we not, staying in touch more? Because it's just like old times. And so I always want to write the book that I want to read. And I just thought that would be a really interesting thing to explore, was this friendship that was kind of rekindled because they had been the Golden Doves when they were teenagers. And now here they are back as the Golden Doves again when they're older.
Yeah, it's a very interesting ebb and flow, because they don't necessarily want to work together in the beginning, and they don't always necessarily get along, but there is this deep connection between them, which feels authentic. It feels like a real friendship between two women.
Oh, good. I loved writing Arlette because I could give her all the French stuff. And she coaches Josie on being, an authentic French girl. Because, when they were in the underground, even if your buttons were sewn on in a different way, in an American way, a cross stitch versus the French way, the Gestapo could tell that you were really not French. So I love that whole thing of Arlette coaching her on how to be French.
I did too. I found that really interesting. I did not know the button thing at all. The details, the attention to details, especially in the fashion, because Arlette has a thing for fashion, and those details and the hairstyles and all of that was really interesting. All of that, the Frenchification, I suppose.
Yeah, that's the fun part.
Well, I think it would be really wonderful if we could hear a little bit from the book. Would you mind reading a bit for us?
Sure. Maybe I'll read the very first chapter, not the whole thing, but just, a page of the first chapter to give you a little piece of it. And this is Josie Anderson. She's half Jewish, living in El Paso, Fort Bliss, Texas, as a kind of a low-level worker. What she's doing is vetting the German scientists that are coming over and making sure that they're being truthful about their past. So this is Josie. Fort Bliss, Texas, 1952. I wake at dawn, face down on the sofa, thinking I'm back in Block 10. The living room windows open a crack, and another Texas dust storm blows like hell outside, pummeling the room with more sand than dust. I swing my feet to the floor, head pounding. 65 dossier photos taped above the sofa flutter in the wind, and the men look down on me. Mengele, von Braun, Speer. I stand, head for the window, and kick over a half-full beer can. A gust hits my little shrine on the coffee table, the votive still flickering under my mother's picture, in the photo of Arlette and me, arms linked at liberation. The wind catches my mother's photo and sails it into the air. I lunge to catch it before it falls, and then I set it back in its spot. I shuffle to the window, sand swirling in the air outside, so thick that the Franklin Mountains in the distance are just blurry mounds. A pigeon sits outside on the sill, waiting out the storm. I wave her away and thump the window closed. The kitchen wall clock reads 6:30 a.m. I'm already late. Can't wait to get this over with, hopefully a routine job, by my rules this time. I pull on my regulation pinkish shirt, green blouse, and drab field jacket, then slide my silver PPK into my shoulder holster. That simple act calms me, the brown grip, the perfect size for my hand. It's the Nazi police gun I confiscated from the suitcase of an incoming scientist who swore he didn't know how it got there. I stuff a pair of hospital gloves into one pocket, grab the welcome basket, and drive a government-issued Jeep past the massive rocket at the entrance that reads, "Welcome to Fort Bliss, your Army Anti-Aircraft and Guided Missile Center." I read the latest dossier as I drive. They all had quirks from their intake forms. One bathes obsessively. One masturbates too much. Krepp's quirk is that he's fastidious about his clothes and insisted he and his wife, Irma, buy all new luggage for the trip, specifying the exact models of the suitcases. Each new scientist was bound by their contract to declare the contents of each bag, but he'd written a missive on the packed items, down to his 10 pairs of undershorts and his wife's cosmetic collection. I find 210 Canyon Road on the outskirts of a Fort Bliss residential neighborhood, a basic El Paso 2-bedroom ranch house trying its best to be nondescript. It's the kind of place where military families come to forget the war and forge blindly into the 1950s with the help of bourbon and barbecue. Only this is no average family.
Thank you. What's next for you? Are you still on your book tour at the moment?
I have two more events. Yeah, one out in California and then one in Bethlehem, Connecticut on June 4th, which is super fun. During COVID, we couldn't have any more events at Caroline Faraday's house. And we had done one every year at lilac season. And so this year we get to do it again. So that's super fun.
Fun. So do you have another book in the works? Can we expect another book from you?
I do. The next one is about Martha's Vineyard during World War II. And my mother, her family came to Martha's Vineyard in 1891. And she grew up there, not a wealthy summer person, but as, she was, there's no better way to describe it than she was poor and lived on a farm. And she used to tell me about during World War II, there was an army base on Martha's Vineyard. And the Jeeps would go by and they would stand on the street and watch them go by. And what they were doing was learning to rappel off the cliffs of Martha's Vineyard. And they were preparing for Normandy, the big battle. And she said that half of those boys didn't come home and they were like their island trained boys. And they were so sad about it. And I just thought, that's going to be an interesting thing to write about. No one's done it, I don't think. And also there were lots of German U-boats in the waters off of Cape Cod and Martha's Vineyard. And so that may or may not feature into the plot, which is, I think, very interesting that there were Nazis kind of just like sailing around the Eastern Seaboard.
That is, well, I'm definitely going to look out for that book. And so where can people find you if they want to keep up to date with what you're doing and find out when this next book will come out, all that?
My website, marthahallkelly.com, is kind of the nexus of all those things. And then, of course, Instagram, Facebook. Yeah, that's the best way.
Perfect. So I will include links to all of that so that people can find you very easily in our show notes. And thank you so much, Martha. It was so lovely meeting you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you again to Martha Hall Kelly for such a lovely conversation. You can find Martha on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Martha Hall Kelly. and on her website, marthahallkelly.com. Please join me next week when I'll be speaking with author and founder and CEO of The Financial Diet, Chelsea Fagan, about her latest novel, A Perfect Vintage. Check back next week to see if your questions have been answered and to hear a reading from her book. Thank you for listening to Storytime in Paris. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity, and you can find me on all socials at Jennyphoria. That's JennyPhoria. If you like this podcast, please take a moment to rate and review it wherever you listen to podcasts. This is the fastest and easiest way to help the podcast grow, which will help me attract more great authors to bring to you. Please also spread the word to all the people you know who also love to read. If you'd like to go even deeper, join our book club over on Patreon at patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio, where I invite authors who have been on the podcast to come speak with us about their books and delve even deeper into the secrets we couldn't spoil on the podcast. Thank you again, and happy reading! This episode of Storytime in Paris was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more on this show and shows like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com.